Now, before we move on and start taking a look at some of the other options, I'm just going to change this patches filter that we had from before, change that to a regular filter, make a little bit of a edit to this, make it curves, and we can see that showing up. Now, one thing we can do is use multiple filters. So I'm going to select our line between our filter and our altitude output and just add another filter. So we can combine multiple filters, go ahead and change that to a sine wave, and now we have our fractal traveling through two different filters, and we can easily add more filters if we wanted to create whatever it is that we want. I'm also going to go up to the top and click Show All Previews in Graph, just so that we don't have to keep turning these back on and off. Before it was set to only noises and colors would show up, but now that everything is showing, I don't have to go ahead and click on Show in Graph every time I change something. I'm going to zoom out a little, and we can see the progression of this material a little bit better. We can see the original fractal, zoom in, and then we can see once it hits the filter, our first filter changes, brings out some of those darker areas and makes the whiter areas a little bit brighter. So it's kind of working like a contrast. And then once we hit our sine wave, we can see that creates some very large changes. And if I wanted to, I could go ahead and click in here again, add another filter. In this case, we have another sine wave. So now we have two sine waves modifying our overall filter. Let's go ahead and zoom out. And I'm going to delete all of our filters now. So we're just back working with our simple fractal, Perlin noise value. And let's move all the way down to the bottom to some of our math nodes. I'm going to select the line connecting between our altitude and simple fractal and click to add a math node. And now we can see this math node showing up immediately. And really, we don't have any options for editing this specific one. Currently, this math node is set to sine. We can see the effects of this showing up, and we can easily compare our different images to see that overall effect. And then if we click in our options, we can see all of the different available math nodes that we're able to connect to this specific area. Now we can see a lot of grayed out ones as well. That's because we cannot use them for adjusting between our fractal and our output node. So if it's grayed out, that basically means it's just unavailable for you to use for that specific option. Within our math nodes, we have so many different available options, basically as many options as we do with our filters. So let's go through some of our main options right now. Currently we're set to the sine. We also have an arc cosine. But we can also see that we really don't have the ability to adjust these numerically or control them besides their default value. So they're basically going to be the same and just give us that overall effect without the ability to really edit anything like we have in the filter option. So some of these will give us the same sort of effect as a filter, but filters will give us the ability to make further modifications. A math node is fairly straightforward. We can go to floor, and we can see this is very similar to the steps that we had before in the previous chapter when we were working with filters, but we don't have the ability to change this and adjust our different values. So sometimes one will work better than another. We have a fractional part, and we can see this creates sort of those negative values once again, where we can see the overall white and black very close to each other, creating some very harsh cutoffs. We can bring this down to invert. And now, as I was talking about before, where we were using our opposite function for a filter, this is our invert option. And as you can see, it doesn't exactly invert as you would expect it to, it works a little bit differently because we still have our white areas in the same place if we look at our different nodes, and we end up with a very harsh look overall, and also it is extremely flat. If I turn off fit vertically, then we can see it pretty much just expands all the way, and we really don't see any terrain. So some of these will work for terrains and some of them won't. We also have our power option, and we can see once that shows up, we don't really have anything for it, but that's also because this isn't connected to anything, and typically we'd want to connect this to a node. If I connect this to our fractal directly, so it's going to our power and then back to our fractal, we can see the effect that that creates. And it's quite interesting. By using the exact same node back and forth to itself, we can create a really interesting looking terrain. We can change that to square root. You can see this overall just adjusts our values, but really doesn't give us a whole lot. And like I said, we really can't edit this. You can also go to multiply, and with the multiply, we actually do have the option to adjust our overall effect. And we can also see that we have a node, our multiply by node, where we can adjust and connect to other options. I could even connect this directly back to that fractal node. And that'll give us a pretty neat look. And we'll go back, and we can change that. You can see the invert again. But let's take a look at our conversions. We have color to brightness. And this really isn't going to show up as anything because we cannot connect this to a fractal node. We can see that our input, if we select it, will not allow us to connect that directly. We can also see that it's showing up as a different color, which is green. And now a lot of the time, the way these colors are set up will give you a good indication of what it is you can connect them to. Currently this is green, but we can't connect to anything, none of our available inputs or outputs. And basically this is something we would want to use as a connection to another node. So right now, with this direct connection, it's not really going to work. We can go to our vector operations, where we have our decomposer 3. And we can see that we can adjust this directly to our position, but really that's not going to do us any good because we cannot connect this directly to our fractal, which is really what we're using to create our elevation. So in this case, this isn't something you would want to use as a direct connection between your simple fractal, or any fractal, or a noise, to your altitude. You can see the same thing with the length option, and we can also tell that the color is red. If we take a look at the connection between our position and our fractal, we notice that that is red. And that's a good indication that we can connect this directly to our position. And we can see this has created a sort of a crater shape, but we have absolutely no way to modify this or edit this whatsoever. And you can see that we have another output on the top of for dot product. But the only thing we can really adjust this and connect it to is our position once again. And that's not really going to give us any good looking terrains. So I'm just going to delete our math node. And the next thing we want to take a look at is our turbulence nodes. So I'm going to zoom in here and pull our fractal down just a little. I also want to reconnect our altitude to our fractal so that we can see our terrain again. And our turbulence nodes are located over here on the left in the bottom section of the top. And I'm just going to click Add Turbulence Noise, or Turbulence Node, making sure that we clicked in a overall invisible area. And we can see this is directly connected to our position right now, and it's really not connected to our overall fractal or our creation of the actual terrain. So right now it's not affecting anything because it's really not connected to an output. So we would need to connect this directly to our fractal in order for it to work. So we're going to select our fractal. And now we need to decide what it is we'd like to control with our turbulence. One of the really neat things we can use is our origin. So what we can do is either extract our origin, and then let's just take a look at that right now. If we extract our origin, we end up with a constant node, and we could either connect that directly to our turbulence, or we can select our constant and replace that with turbulence, which will automatically make the correct connections. But if you're already working with this available node that we added, you can just select the origin directly from the side of your node without even having to go in, which is a much quicker method. And then we can adjust our turbulence. Now currently this is our simple turbulence, but what I want to use is our advanced turbulence because it's going to give us much better options, because we can adjust our turbulence with a noise node. And we can see all of our different patterns that we have available for our other noise nodes. And what it'll end up doing, since we are connected to our origin, is creating some really neat looking effects along and adding detail to our terrain. So let's go through and we'll just select some different options. If we take a look already, we can see we have this nice twisting in here throughout our terrain caused by our chipped pattern. Also note that the turbulence node is not going to show up in the graph. It's not really going to give us an overall look of what it is that we'd like to adjust. So we can't really see the direct effect on our fractal, but if we take a look at the actual fractal, we can see the turbulence node affecting it directly. So in this case, we do not see the original fractal once we plug in our advanced turbulence when it's connected to our origin, or when it's connected to the majority of the values. But we can see that overall look, which is really quite neat, where we just have all of these different twists in our terrain, and it gives us a really neat looking effect. Now if you want to see what that's going to look like with it off, we can just delete that connection, and now we can see what that terrain looked like before, and then you can just reconnect the origin back on there to see what it looks like with your turbulence on. And if we just click back on our turbulence node, we can also look at some of the other options. We have a with vortices, and basically what that will do, if we click that on and off, you can really see it if we take a look at the simple fractal preview, since that is going to preview exactly what it looks like with turbulence on. So let's just, with that turned off, we'll take a look at our node, turn on with vortices, and now we can see that we have all of these different extra details and sort of swirls in it that we didn't have before. So it adds an extra bit of definition with some nice amounts of detail in there. And if we take a look at the output observer too, and really see those overall changes, you can sort of see what that does. And it just allows us to swirl a little bit more and give a little more interesting looking terrain. It also adds a sort of connectors between the lower gradients to the upper gradients. And we can see that in some of our sections where we just have some of these areas just connecting downward, and then this sort of swirl and rotate. So whether or not you want that turned off or turned on really depends on sort of the look that you're going for. And actually the View Reference Manual does give a good representation of functions with it on and functions with it off. Plus, of course, you can take a look at the actual node itself, and we'll just go ahead and zoom in to see that a little bit better. And we can really see those areas, mainly in here. We can see little bits of twists and turns and these extra little options that are being added. And if I turn that off, we really don't see that much anymore. So I'll go ahead and turn that back on, because we get a much more interesting looking terrain with it on. And we can go through some of the different options. We can move down to crystals. And now we can see the overall effect with our crystals. And if you want to kind of see exactly what you're doing beforehand, one good thing to do is just create a separate noise node. So I'm just going to click on a blank area and just add a noise node. And we can also see that this remembers exactly the same noise node that we had set in the earlier chapters. But what I want to do is just take a look at our turbulence nodes by looking at the noise node, so we can really see what sort of effect we're going to get, since the advanced turbulence doesn't give us a preview. So this way we can separate it, and even though this isn't connected, so it's not really showing up, it is connected to our position, which really isn't going to affect anything. So we're going to go to our noise node, make sure that is selected. I'm going to change our wavelength to 0.5 on all of our axes, because our turbulence node is going to be an even number. And we can see that we have our crystals on. So let's change that to crystals. And now we can see what those crystals look like and what that noise node looks like and what the turbulence is going to affect on our origin. And let's also just take a look and change this to the Voronoi, which is a really neat tessellation that we can use to control this. And of course, we don't see that showing up right away, but if we take a look at the preview, we can see this sort of effect that's going to create. And it is a really cool node for using, or pattern for using procedural terrains. I'm going to change that Voronoi. And now we can see that show up on our terrain and also in our preview. So if we go ahead and zoom in, we can take a look at that a little bit better, and also select whether or not we'd like to turn on our vortices. But overall, since we're just adjusting the origin, we're not going to see as large of an effect with this turbulence noise. We can adjust through some of our other patterns. I'm going to go through line patterns and select fabric. And now we can see that really showing up, where we can really see that fabric pattern. And if we take a look at the actual, the original node for that, we can see what that looks like. And typically that's something you might not want to use for a terrain, but it is available to create some pretty neat looking effects if needed. But basically you just go through all of these and see exactly what you want. If we move this to an onion, since we are using this to change our origin, we end up with a really neat looking terrain, lots of twists and turns. And if we go and actually look at the original onion, we can see what that looks like as the original node. And it's just a fairly basic noise node or math pattern, but it does create a really neat looking terrain once we use that together with the turbulence node. Go back and select our turbulence. And now we can adjust even more within our turbulence, and not just our noise, but also the wavelength and the overall size of our turbulence, the actual origin of the turbulence itself, And one thing that's also really cool is we could even control the origin of this turbulence with another turbulence node, which can create some very neat looking effects. And we'll do that in just a sec, but let's go through some of our other options. You can see we have some of the same options that we have some of other nodes. We can see we have our largest feature. We can increase that so that the largest feature is now at least the number that we have set. Make that a little bit larger, and we'll see even more of an effect of that. We have our amplitude, which is going to adjust the overall contrast of our turbulence. And we can, like I said, we can really see that showing up by looking directly at the fractal. Increase our amplitude even more. We can also see much more twisting and turning, and much tighter spacing between all of our different sections. Decrease our amplitude, we're going to notice a lot less. And if we take a look at the actual noise node itself, we can see that we also have the scale option like we do for all noise nodes. And if we go back, we can see we also have a repeat function. And our scale, in this case for turbulence, even though we are using a noise to control it, is still based on our wavelength. So we can adjust our repeat. You can see the sort of effects that creates. And we can also adjust the roughness. And in this case, it's going to create sort of some undesired results, very sharp edges. So we might want to decrease our roughness. We could even decrease it even more and see the kind of effect that creates. I'm going to decrease our largest feature just so we have something a little more even. Maybe increase our roughness a little bit more and also decrease how many times we're repeating. And if we scale this down a little bit more so we can see more of our terrain and more of the function that's creating it, we can see these options a little bit better. Increase our largest feature. Increase our amplitude. You can see this on more of a global scale. And we can turn off our width vortices. And with the onion, it's a good way to tell exactly what this option does a little bit better, because now we can see that we have these very defined rings in our fractal. And then if we take a look at the actual terrain itself, we can see those very sharp lines in there, and also the cutoffs that are caused by those. If we turn that back on, those disappear. They blend together very nicely. But we can still see the overall circles, so we still have that original shape, but we have a very good blend in between with some nice connecting lines to give us some really neat looking geometry. Let's go ahead and adjust our wavelength. Let's bring this down to 0.5 on all of our axes. And now we can see a bit more of that. And if we take a look at the actual fractal, we can see we've just lowered the amount and the size of our rings that we have. We can decrease that even more to 0.2 on all of our axes to see even more of a dramatic effect. And the actual terrain, we really don't see too much of a change, except much tighter spacing between all of our different rings. Create that and make it a little bit larger. Let's bring it up to a 5. Now we really don't see the overall effect of that very much, although we do see it a little. We're basically in one ring overall, rather than several rings twisting and turning throughout our surface. Change that down to 2 on all of our axes. And we can see we have basically the same sort of an effect. Now we can also, we don't have to use straight values the entire time. We can stretch these further if we wanted to. I can make this one 3.2, and I'll make this one 0.75. And now we can see that we have more of that stretching. And if we really take a look at the fractal, we can see that a lot better, where we're sizing our node and stretching it inward on our x and outward on our y. And the z is pretty much staying the same. And if we adjust our z to 5, we're really not going to see a major change. And that's because we're basically editing two-dimensional maps in this method, because we're basically just adjusting our white and black areas of our overall terrain. So set that just down to 1. And now we can even adjust the wavelength dependent on another node if we wanted to. I'm just going to zoom out. And let's take a look at a way of making this a little bit cleaner and also providing a different sort of an effect. I'm just going to select our connector between our position and our simple fractal. And I'm going to click to add a math node. And we can see that currently right now it's not allowing us to add a math node. And mainly the reason for that is that our default math node, because of the one we added before, is not compatible. So if I add a math node, we can see the dot product shows up. Well, this current node is not compatible with this line. So therefore, when we click on it, it will not allow us to add it in, because this has become our default math node. Every time we click to add a math node, since this is the last one we created, it is now our default. So if you ever get to a point where you click on something and you want to add a node, it's best to make sure that you click off of your line sometimes, try to add it if you're not sure if you can add it or not, and just change the different operation. I'm going to change this to vector operations, and I'm going to select offset. And now let's delete our connector between our fractal and our position. Just click on it, hit the delete key, and now if we select from our simple fractal up to our math node, we can see we can now connect to that offset. And we can also connect our offset directly to our position. And now what I'm going to do is take our connector between our position and our turbulence and connect that to our offset. And that way we have this a little cleaner, and it can produce a different sort of effect, but typically it stays about the same. We can also use this offset node as a way to change our origin rather than connecting directly to our turbulence. So what I'm going to do is just disconnect our connection to our turbulence node and just all of our connections as if we were starting just with something newer. Go to our offset and connect. Either we can extract, or we can just use that side connector since we are showing all of our different options, and just connect that directly to our turbulence. And now we can see that turbulence showing up. And that's if you want to be able to use your origin to connect to something else rather than connecting directly to that turbulence. And then we could connect this turbulence either directly to the position, and then we end up with basically the same sort of an effect. And it's basically just another way of working with these different options. So let's take a look now and go back, extract our origin once again, and this time we're going to replace it with turbulence. So now we have another turbulence node. And in this case, we're using the same exact one. But what I want to do is connect to our offset. And I'm just going to zoom out so we can see all of these together and frame it. And now we have another turbulence node that we can use to adjust our origin connected to our offset, with our offset being connected directly to a turbulence node, which is connected to our position. I'm going to change our new turbulence node and change this to something a little bit different. Use the Voronoi. So now we have that taken into account with the creation of our turbulence. We can really see that showing up. And we can adjust the overall wavelength if we want, because right now, because we added another turbulence node, after we already defined our current and our previous advanced turbulence node, we have the same exact settings showing up. So what I want to do is adjust our wavelength. I'm just going to change this to 1 on all of our axes. And we can see that a little bit better, not so much stretching. And I'm just going to zoom in. And let's take a look at using another turbulence node to control portions of this turbulence node. So I'm going to extract our origin, and we can replace that constant node with turbulence. We can either connect that to the position directly. We want to make sure that we select that line. And when we have several lines together, sometimes the easiest way to make those connections is just to delete the current connection, and then we can select from the top. And we can either connect this to our offset, or we could even connect this to another turbulence node. So I'm going to connect it to that turbulence node rather than our offset. And we want to adjust this new turbulence node and make it a little bit different. And we'll select our cracks from our line patterns. And we'll just take a look at the overall surface. And if I turn off with vortices, we can see the effect that that creates. And we're really going to see more of those cracks in there now. If we take a look, we have a lot more of a erratic surface. And if we take a look at our actual fractal, just zoom in a little bit more and see the preview, we can also see those cracks showing up. And that's because our cracks, if we go back to our noise node that we're using for our options, and take a look at the cracks, we can see what that looks like. And we'll just go back, turn with vortices back on. And we can adjust some of these options if we want to. Largest feature, maybe our amplitude. Paying attention to our preview so that we know what it looks like, and also our output so we can see the actual terrain. Now the number of times we can go ahead and connect these nodes over and over using turbulence nodes and all of the different ones is really quite endless. So really it's a matter of when you get to the point where it just becomes excessive. In this case, it might not be needed to have all of these extra nodes on here. And we can also switch in between, and I could connect this to our offset now, and we can end up with an entirely different look. But overall, we basically have the same terrain. And it is a little bit different now by making that change. But basically, you can go on and on and on and keep adding nodes to control some of the more similar functions, but sometimes you just don't need to. In this case, we really don't need all of these different ones. I just wanted to show you that it is possible to connect a lot of these different features. And also, we can use some of our existing nodes to control a variety of these different options. So if I was to extract our wavelength right now for this advanced turbulence node, I can connect from our constant to either another turbulence node. So we'll go ahead and connect that top one. And now we have something a little bit different showing up, because our wavelength is now being directly controlled by this turbulence. And that's just one way we can put all these things together. I'm going to delete our constant, which sits there as an extra now. I'm also going to go ahead and just turn off show and graph for these, because it really doesn't show anything, and there's really no point in having that, creating that confusion. Because if we look at this right now, we can tell there's quite a large amount of nodes, and it can be a little confusing once we reach these sorts of levels. And we can also control some of these other features of this fractal with those turbulence nodes. But overall, for the main point for this fractal node, the main things we can control are wavelength and our origin. Currently right now I have our origin selected, but I could easily adjust this to our wavelength as well. And also one of the ways we can tell is if we just zoom in to our node, and I'm going to delete our connection to our turbulence, we can see the top two connections are our wavelength and origin, and those are both red. And we can also tell that all of our connections to turbulence pretty much have to be red. So all of these other settings really aren't going to work. If we take a look at our largest feature, if I click and start pulling that out, we see that we can't connect to that turbulence node, although we can connect that to the noise node. So we can control that with our fractals, but not with our noise or our turbulence. So I'm going to connect our top one now. We're going to use our wavelength. And now we can see we have an entirely different type of terrain. Something that's really pretty neat looking. And we have all of these different options and different turbulences all being taken into account to create this. So let's go ahead and just remove some of our other turbulence. So we're just working with one. And now we can see with just that one, it's a little bit different. I'm going to disconnect the origin, which you do just by clicking where we would connect it. So now we're just controlling our overall wavelength with our advanced turbulence. But keep in mind too, we really can't see the overall fractal now, and it's basically an overall white. I'm going to turn off fit vertically. We can see that it's an extremely flat surface. So whether or not we'll get that sort of an effect in the advanced material or in the terrain editor, really we'll just have to click OK and see. So I'm just going to close this out and click OK. And let's let this refresh in our terrain editor. And we can see we have a very flat surface, and we really don't see as much definition as we have within the function editor. So there really can be a difference by using that fit vertically option. You can see without using it, we can see a little bit better representation of what it is that it looks like. With it turned off, we can see a much more flat surface, and this is basically what it looks like. So just another thing to keep in mind, let's go back to our turbulence, and we could change this to something else. I could use crystals, and now we can see that affecting our overall wavelength. We could use the spiral in our math patterns. We just see a little bit of a divot in there, so I'm going to change our wavelength. I also want to zoom back out, and I'm going to change our wavelength to 0.5 on all of our axes. And now we can see the spiral showing up, which really doesn't look like a spiral in this case because we're controlling the overall wavelength, which is going to show up a little bit differently. So we'll disconnect that. We could go back, zoom in, and reconnect our origin if we wanted. And now we can see that overall effect. So really, depending on what it is that you want to create, we could also connect both of these together. So I can connect both of our wavelength and our origin to even the same turbulence node. So there's really a whole lot we can do with it. And in combination with other things, you can create some really interesting looking terrains.